Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're all well. Thank you for joining my podcast. This is episode 3 of the Chris Watts saga. Today's episode is sponsored by DESKTRONIC. Use code Paddy, DESKTRONIC.co.uk. if you need a motorized desk. There's a few of you now that have gone over to Patreon. There'll be some exclusive videos over there. Links are in the description, so get yourself over. There's free videos. In fact, all links are in the description and all links are pinned in the comments. Thank you for supporting the podcast. There's quite a few of you that have been interested in this, so it's good to see. Thank you so much. The Reckoning of Chris Watts, Part 3, the finale. Christopher Lee Watts believed he was a master mechanic. He believed he could treat human lives, human emotions, criminal investigations like a faulty car engine. In his mind, he had calculated every variable. He had chosen a remote, desolate graveyard at an oil site known as Survey 319. He disposed of his pregnant wife and his 2 young daughters under the complete cover of early morning darkness, and he returned to his corporate work routine before his crew even arrived on site. Chris truly believed, I think, that his 33-year-old reputation as a quiet, compliant, helpful and nice guy would buy him all the time that he needed. He thought police would treat this as a standard baffling missing persons case, allowing him to slowly play the role of a worried, blindsided husband for a few weeks before quietly moving into his new, unburdened future with his girlfriend, Nicole Kessinger. Problem is, Chris made a fatal psychological error. He measured the entire world by his own cold lack of empathy. Because he felt nothing for his family, he assumed that no one else would look too closely. He completely failed to realize that people loved his wife. He failed to realize that Shanann had built an ironclad, a hyper-connected network of friends, colleagues and followers that watched out for her every single day. And she did have a fantastic group of friends, I'll say that. Because of this single oversight, his timeline didn't last for weeks. It didn't last for days. It didn't even last for 12 hours. At 12:10 on Monday, August the 13th, less than 10 hours after Shanann had walked through her own front door, her close friend and business colleague, Nicole Atkinson, called the Frederick Police Department. Shanann had missed an important prenatal hospital appointment. She wasn't answering the door. Texts weren't even going through. They were sitting there on unread. The car was sitting in the garage, but the house was dead silent. And that's what gets me about this story is he couldn't have picked the worst day to do this on, because she had the kids going to school, starting school for the first day, and she had a doctor's appointment. She had a lot going on. So people would know that she was missing. People would realize something was up very, very quickly on this day. Like I say, he couldn't have picked the worst day to do it on. When the first responding officer, Officer Coonrod, arrived on the scene, he found himself waiting on the front porch for Chris to arrive and open the door. When Chris finally pulled up in his work truck, he wasn't rushing. He didn't look panicked either. He parked, walked up the driveway, and he was smiling. He was casual. He greeted the officer as if nothing was wrong. Bearing in mind, by this point, he'd already told Nicole Atkinson and Nick Atkinson that he was going to be 5 minutes and that he was 5 minutes away. But basically, he told them that 3 times, and it was still an hour later and he still hadn't got home. The moment his boots hit the concrete of his driveway, the clock began ticking on his total, irreversible destruction of his life. Inside Saratoga Trail, pristine crime scene. When Chris was let in by Officer Coonrod into the massive 5-bedroom home on Saratoga that Monday afternoon, he wasn't cooperating, he was performing. Law enforcement entered the house. At first, didn't really think anything was up. The house was immaculate, just that Shanann left it. Once inside, it was discovered that obviously Shanann had left behind her phone, her medication, basically her whole world. Considering she needed all this for her digital marketing job, it did raise suspicions. Chris was then volunteering random information about their lives while a police officer was trying to find out where his children were. When Coonrod asked Chris what had happened, Chris spun a weak, disorganized narrative. He claimed that Shanann had gotten into an emotional but non-violent conversation about a marital separation around about 5 a.m. He claimed that when he left for work at 5:45 a.m, Shanann was alive in bed. He suggested that maybe a friend had picked her up and that she'd gone to a friend's house. But he couldn't provide a name, a car, a description, destination, nothing. In the master bedroom, the bed was made, but the top sheet and duvet cover were missing, leaving a bare exposed mattress. In the trash can, police found a discarded pregnancy test. In the trash can, police found a discarded sheet, later identified as being Shanann's sheets. While Chris was downstairs trying to maintain his calm, helpful demeanour, Neighbour Nate Tristanicic was walking over to the police, and he had a high-definition security camera mounted on his garage. This pointed directly from the driveway of his house to the Watts home. He invited Chris and the officer to his house to review the footage. In Nate's living room, they gathered around his huge television screen. The footage was clear. It showed the quiet street at 5:17 on a Monday morning, and Chris making trips back and to after he backed the truck up to the driveway. He backs the truck up all the way to the edge of the garage door. This is something that he didn't normally do, and Nate even said this to the detective. The camera captures Chris moving back and forth between the garage of the cab and his truck. Because of the shadows and the tree, you can't see exactly what he's carrying, but it looks like he is carrying at one point a petrol can, and he's moving something from the garage into the truck. After him making several trips back and into the house, back to the truck, into the house, back to the truck. We can't say for certain, but it looks as if a child's shadow appears on the driveway. Like I said before, do your own research, because I think that is a child that he picks up, but you do your own research. You can't see it clearly enough to say definitively, but have a look. Anything I referenced would have been on my channel. Nate's camera keeps running for the rest of the day, and it doesn't show anybody leaving that house. No Shanann, no Bella, no Cece, nobody. No mysterious friend picking her up. As the footage plays on the screen, Nate and Chris both watch him making these trips. From outsiders looking in, you can visibly see that Chris is starting to get stressed. Hands on his head, swaying back and forth. Even at one point knocks his sunglasses onto his face, which he didn't mean to do. Obviously stressed. Nate later recounts that Chris could barely look at the television. He was pacing back and forth. He began talking rapidly, pointing out random details on the screen, distracting the officer, giving him random information about a break-in and Jimmy and a screwdriver that he'd had to deal with thieves a week or two before. One thing, it seems to be clear at that point that nobody had left that house if you'd done a deep analysis of that footage, but the police weren't to know that at this point. On the Tuesday the 14th, the local police realised they were out their depth. Then they officially called in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Chris's home now being descended upon by the media and the authorities. It was a public performance that he would give now, come to known as the Preach on the Porch, or the Sermon on the Porch. This would be a public performance that he would give to the news crew, and it cemented his status as a prime suspect. If people had any doubts about him before, especially Tammy Lee, after watching the news coverage, they were now more or less certain that he'd done it, given his behaviour. He stood before the microphones wearing a grey t-shirt, crossing his arms over his chest in a defensive posture. He was smiling, he kept smirking, duping delight as known as in behavioural analysis. He looked directly into the camera and said, "I just want them back so bad. The house is not complete without them. If anybody has them, just bring them back." He didn't cry, he didn't show panic. He spoke about his daughters, though, in the past tense, describing how they used to eat dinner, or how Bella used to watch out the window. He looked like a man trying to remember his lines from a script that he'd hurriedly written on his drive home. Watching from the FBI headquarters in Denver, behavioural analysts didn't see a grieving father. They saw a family annihilator trying to buy time. The interrogation room. Enter Tammy Lee and Graham Coder. On Wednesday the 15th, Chris Watts voluntarily walked into the Denver headquarters of the FBI. He must have thought that he was smarter than the federal investigators. He must have believed that his decades of people-pleasing, his quiet compliance, his lack of a criminal record would act as a shield. He thought he was going to help them clear his name so they could look elsewhere. He didn't realise he was walking into a masterclass of psychological warfare. Across from him sat two expert interrogators, CBI agent Tammy Lee and FBI agent Graham Coder. They didn't storm in the room shaking handcuffs, they didn't scream at him, they knew his profile. They knew he was a passive dependent personality who shut down at the first sign of conflict. If they attacked him, they knew he would stop talking. In their minds, they had to become his friend. For hours, Graham Coder and Tammy Lee built rapport with Chris. They talked about how difficult marriage could be. They validated his financial stress. They agreed with him that Shanann could be dominant and intense. They let Chris complain about his life, letting him feel like they were on his side. Chris relaxed, he leaned forward, and he felt safe. Tammy Lee gently introduced the concept of the polygraph test. She explained that it was a standard tool to eliminate him, and so that they could focus their massive resources on finding his family. Chris, completely confident in his ability to control his emotions, or lack of emotions if you want, readily agreed to this polygraph. Tammy Lee carefully attached the equipment. She wrapped the rubber convoluted tubes around his chest to measure respiration. She placed the blood pressure cuff on his arm, attached the metal galvanized sensors to his fingertips to measure his electrodermal activity, the microscopic sweat glands that react when the brain experiences the stress of a lie. She read him the baseline questions to start with. Is your name Christopher? Are we in Denver? Then she transitioned to the devastating questions. Did you cause the physical disappearance of your wife, Shanann? Chris answers no. Did you cause the physical disappearance of your daughters, Bella and Celeste? Chris answers no. Do you know where your family is right now? Chris answers no. His voice didn't shake. His face remained flat. He believed in his mind that he'd conquered it. But while the conscious mind can lie, the autonomic nervous system cannot. The human body is hardwired to survive. When a killer lies about his victims, the brain fires a massive uncontrollable spike of electrical and physiological panic through the nervous system. When Tammy Lee unstrapped him and he left the room to score the charts, the numbers were definitive. In a federal polygraph examination, any score lower than a -4 indicates absolute deception. Chris Watts did not score a -4. He scored a -28. It was one of the highest deceptive scores Agent Lee had ever seen in her career. Tammy Lee walked back to the interrogation room. She sat down across from Chris and laid the polygraph charts flat on the table between them. She looked him in the eye, voice dropping its warm, friendly tone and replacing it with absolute, unyielding authority. She told him directly that he'd failed the test completely. This is the exact moment where the psychological makeup of Chris becomes its own undoing. A different type of killer might have stood up, demanded a lawyer, stormed out the room even, screamed his innocence, but Chris had spent his entire life running away from direct confrontation and conflict. He didn't know how to handle someone looking at him. He collapsed inward, his posture slumped, and he's just staring at his hands. Graham Coder stepped in, brilliant interrogation tactic known as theme development, also the read technique where they find blame, get the killer to admit that they were there on the scene, get them to admit that they were involved in a murder, albeit accidental, and then 3, they'll go about disproving it all, that it was accidental and it was actually a first-degree murder. And that's how they get people. Chris would never confess being a monster who murdered his children in cold blood. They needed him to confess while still protecting his image. They knew that was the way that they were going to break him. Let me suggest, Chris, did Shanann do something to those girls? Did she hurt them? Did you react to a blind rage to protect them? Chris must have thought that that was a good idea to latch onto, so he went with it. He then spins this horrific cowardly fabrication. He claims that after he told Shanann that he wanted a divorce, he walked out the room, and when he looked back through the baby monitor, he saw Shanann actively strangling Celeste in her crib, while Bella lay lifeless in her bed. He said that he saw them turn blue, but there's a blue tint on the monitor, I noticed, so how we would see him turning blue, I never know. He said that he flew into a blind rage, ran into the room, strangled Shanann to death, just to make her stop. He claimed that in a state of sheer panic, he loaded all 3 of them into his truck and drove them out to Survey 319, the oil site. It's a monstrous lie that attempted to defame Shanann and paint himself as a tragic defender of his children. But Agents Lee and Coder didn't correct him. They didn't call him a liar. They just went along with it. They comforted him, and they handed him a piece of paper and a pen. They had now his admission of murder on tape, but they needed him to draw the map to where the bodies were. Chris Watts drew a map on a legal pad marking 3 specific locations on a 319 site. Tammy Lee produces a photo of Survey 319, and Chris marks on it the locations of the 3. He asked Tammy Lee, when was this taken? And she replies, today. Survey 319 is an oil site, a remote, dusty property owned by his employer, Anadarko. The actual well site is owned by Anadarko. The land is on the Survey Ranch, owned by Bindi Survey. It's located miles out into the flat, wind-scoured plains of Weld, Colorado. The next morning, a massive convoy of unmarked law enforcement vehicles, forensic anthropologists, CBI lab techs, and a heavy excavation machinery pulled up to the site. The environment's harsh, stark, and completely detached from the manicured lawns of Saratoga. It is an industrial wasteland, a barren land. full of just gravel, a dry desert land almost. Forensics begin their grim work. They identified an area of disturbed earth. Not that it was hard to find. Working slowly to preserve the evidence, they began removing the dry, heavy Colorado clay. Less than a foot beneath the surface, they uncovered the body of Shanann. She had been dumped face down into a shallow, hurried hole, still wrapped in the sheet from her master bed. Buried alongside her, the body of her unborn son, who she had had by coffin birth. Buried alongside her was the body of her unborn son. She'd already planned to call him Nico. So the recovery teams start to approach the two massive 20-foot tall steel crude oil storage tanks that dominated the landscape. The thief hatches at the very top of these massive tanks were incredibly small, measuring a mere 8 inches in diameter. The opening is so narrow that it seemed physically impossible for human bodies to pass through them. The recovery operation was a technical nightmare. Forensic teams could not simply reach inside. The tanks are filled with 1,000 gallons of thick, toxic, unrefined crude oil. Specialized hazmat teams needed to be brought in, and risk assessments needed to be done. Permits needed to be signed. In the course of several agonizing hours under a blistering sun, the team slowly drained the oil from the base of the tanks, filtering the sludge through heavy screens to capture any trace evidence. The subsequent autopsy reports released by the coroner's office would shatter any remaining doubt about the absolute cruelty of Chris Watts' actions. While little Celeste showed minimal signs of external trauma, indicating her life may have been taken quickly, before she could comprehend the horror, 4-year-old Bella's autopsy revealed a devastating, heartbreaking reality. Bella had fought for her life. The coroner found multiple lacerations, deep bruising inside her mouth. Her tiny front teeth had been driven into her own lips. The man who was supposed to protect her from every danger in the world was killing her. She had actively struggled against his hands, frantic and terrified until her final breath. What makes this even worse is he obviously made her watch. Well, not made her watch, but she was obviously watching what was going on before he got to her, which makes this even more heinous. Chris Watts had forced his daughter's tiny bodies through those 8-inch openings, believing that the corrosive chemical nature of crude oil would dissolve their remains over time. Washing away his sins and hiding his crimes forever, he'd returned to that very site on Monday morning. Small talk with his crew that arrived there a little bit later and looked completely unfazed by the reality of what lay inside those metal tanks just a few yards away from where he stood. The public revelation of the recovery at Survey 319 triggered a wave of global outrage and grief. The nice guy from North Carolina, the quiet suburban father, was exposed as one of the most clinical, cold-blooded family annihilators in modern criminal history. As the legal proceedings began, the DA's office actively prepared to pursue the death penalty, and the evidence against Chris was an avalanche. The neighbor's video, the polygraph, his own recorded confession, and the undeniable digital trail of his affair with Nicole Kassinger. He was facing a trial that would expose every shameful secret he possessed to the world, but in pursuit of the death penalty, it was stopped, not by a judge, not by a defense lawyer. It was stopped by the profound, unfathomable mercy of Shanann's family. Frank and Sandy, along with Shanann's brother Frankie, sat down with the prosecutors. They stated publicly that they did not want Chris to die. They didn't want another life taken in their daughter's name. They didn't want to endure years of painful appeals, keeping his face on the news. They wanted him to live. They wanted him to wake up every single morning in a concrete cell, staring at four walls, forced to live with the memory of his daughter's final words for the rest of his natural life. Chris entered the Weld County Courthouse to escape the death penalty. He'd signed a plea deal. He was pleading guilty to all 9 counts against him, 3 for the first degree of murder, 2 for the first degree of murder of a child under 12, in a position of trust, and 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. All 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was thick with grief. Frank Ruzick stood at the podium, his voice shaking with a father's broken heart, looking at the man who had been his son-in-law and saying, I trusted you to take care of them, not to kill them. You threw them out like the trash. Judge Kopko did not mince words when delivering the final judgment. He sentenced Chris to 5 consecutive life terms without the absolute possibility of parole, followed by an additional 84 years for the tampering charges, and the judge looked at Chris and stated, "This is perhaps the most inhumane and brutal crime that I've ever dealt with out of the 1,000 cases I have seen." He nodded politely, didn't speak. He accepted his life sentence with the exact same passive compliance he used to navigate his entire life. He was escorted out of the courtroom in shackles. Later, he'd be transferred out of Colorado to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, hidden away from public that despised him. But the psychological mystery of how a man can transform so completely, Chris finally discarded the last of his cowardly fabrications. He admitted that Shanann had never touched the girls. He admitted that he'd murdered them all himself. He detailed the horrific timeline with chilling calm. He recounted how he strangled Shanann on their bed, feeling her pulse fade beneath his fingers. He detailed how he'd driven his daughters out to the oil field, watched them look up at him from the back seat, holding their favourite toys and blankets. He confessed that when he killed Celeste in front of her older sister, Bella looked at him in absolute terror and said final words, "Daddy, no." When the investigator asked him why he did it, Chris couldn't give a logical answer. He simply stated that he felt possessed. That once the fantasy of his new life with Nicole Kessinger took over his mind, his family was no longer his family. I think that's just a cop-out to blame a possession, a demonic possession. But there we are. Today, the massive house on Saratoga Trail in Frederick, it stands there under new ownership. Physical scars of the August have been painted over, but the shadow of the tragedy remains forever, woven into the soil. The endless social media videos that Shanann worked so hard, they still exist, they're still on YouTube, and they're still across the digital universe. Frozen, haunting archives of birthdays, high fives, first steps, declarations, and domestic bliss. When we look back at it all, we're forced to confront a terrifying, deeply unsettling psychological truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes evil is completely quiet. Sometimes evil looks like the polite, soft-spoken neighbour who helps you carry your groceries. It looks like the husband who never argues, always agrees, and always wears the perfect compliant mask of Mr. Nice Guy, until the exact second that he decides to tear your entire world apart. The roots of this horror didn't begin on August the 13th, 2018. They began decades earlier, in the silent, hidden corners of a young boy's mind, who learned how to suppress every emotion, how to hide his true self from the world, and how to wear a mask so flawless by the time it finally broke, there's nothing left underneath but a monster. Concludes my 3-part podcast with Chris Watts. Thank you to DESKTRONIC for sponsoring the video. Use code Paddy. If you can, please go over to Patreon and join there for free. There'll be exclusive videos over on Patreon. Check out the social, Insta, Facebook. You know all the dance by now. There's a PayPal link on the screen, and there is Facebook memberships in the bio. If you have listened to all 3 parts, I want to thank you so much. It means the world to me that you will support my podcast as well as the videos. These podcast episodes take an enormous time to write. I don't use any AI, I write it all myself, so I appreciate you listening. Remember, these cases can be emotional and stressful. But most of all, don't have nightmares. Oh my god, just get it right. Get it right first time, and won't have to sit here all fucking day. Why can't I get my words out? What the fuck? What is going on? Have you fallen asleep yet? Are you asleep? When you count to 10. Count to 10. When you wake up, you will join Paddy's membership. And he returned to corporate work. And he returned to corporate work. Fuck. And he'd returned to his corporate work. Fuck. Because of this and over. Fuck. Not again today. In his mind, he'd calculated that every variable that he'd chosen, a remote, desolate graveyard and an oil fuck, That's what always gets me about this story, is she had so much to do that day. He couldn't have picked the worst day. There's kids were starting. That's what gets me about this. Fucking hell, get it right. When he first, no. When Chris finally pulled up in his white work truck, no, that's wrong. That's not right. That's what always gets me about this story, is she had so much to do that day. He couldn't have picked the worst day. There's kids were starting. That's what gets me about this. Fucking hell, get it right. As the footage plays on the screen, the police officer, you can tell the fuck's sake, just before 5 or just before 6. No, that's wrong. As the footage plays on Nathan's fuckity fuck. As the footage plays on Nathan's screen, the police officer watched the video. No, what's the video? What's the video? Watched the video. One thing to the detective was in that. On the Tuesday the 14th, the local police realised they were out their depth and they officially called in the Colorado? What the fuck is Colorado? Then they officially called in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, plus the FBI. Then they officially they saw it from... Fuck's sake. Chris's home is now a haven for... Chris's home now being swarmed by... Chris's home now being swarmed by media and the police. But while the conscious mind can lie, the mind. Chris must have thought over this quickly and accepted this. No, scrub that. He saw Shanann actively strangling Celeste in her crib. Told him that she told him that he She told him that she knew what she knew, what he knew, what she knew, what he knew, that she knew that he knew. That doesn't make sense. She told him that she knew that he was lying. He didn't know how to tell that the mask had failed. He didn't know. No, scrub that. Still wrapped in the blue sheet. Still wrapped in the... Fuck's sake. Late on the night of August 15th, Chris watched through a crude map. Scrub that as well. Fake. I'm doing that much. I'm going to have to buy a new brush and done that much scrubbing on this. Many outtakes for you guys. Tammy Lee, no, scrub that as well. Survey 319 is a massive convoy of unmarked law enforcement vehicles, forensic anthropologists, CBI lab techs, and a heavy excavation equipped section of CBI lab techs and a heavy excavation fucking hell, 100 yards away in huge metal tanks, just as horrific as this, the psychological scarring and task that was for the recovery teams. Can't even get my words out. Most of all, scrub that. These hatches at the top of these tanks measured in 8 measuring 8 at the base. No, do that again. That sounds like shit the way you done that.